Your tax dollars need to be spent wisely.
These days, conservatives love to talk about balancing the budget, and their go-to solution is cutting spending. As we saw in part 1, that idea isn't completely off base. But here's the twist. Every recent Republican president has added to the deficit and national debt. So while we're being told we need to suck it up now for the promise of some future economic paradise, it's fair to ask, are we getting the full story or just the highlight reel? Today, we're diving back into the government debt. In Chapter 1, we'll break down why Republican cut spending strategies sound good but haven't actually worked to pay off the debt and why it should matter to you. In Chapter 2, we'll look at the Democratic playbook, more taxes, more investment, and why that approach hasn't nailed it either. Then in Chapter 3, we meet the one Democrat who did the unthinkable. He balanced the budget, put us on track to pay off the national debt by 2010, and maybe, just maybe, could have saved us from paying more taxes today. Before we dive in, let's quickly talk about why the federal deficit isn't just a DC problem, it's your problem too. Imagine you're living off your credit cards, swiping to cover groceries, rent, gas, while barely making the minimum payments. At some point, the interest alone eats up your entire paycheck, and suddenly, you're not living, you're just paying off debt. That's basically what happens when the government keeps borrowing without a plan. More it owes, the more of your tax dollars go toward interest, not schools, roads, or healthcare. Just like with personal debt, eventually the spending catches up, and it squeezes out everything else. In part 1, we broke down the national debt, now over $34 trillion. For perspective, if you stacked $1 bills, it would reach the moon and back, twice. When the government spends more than it collects, it has to borrow, which adds pressure to the economy, fuels inflation, and drives up the cost of everything from groceries to gas. And who ends up footing the bill? We do, through higher taxes, slower wage growth, and rising everyday expenses. So yes, the government's debt is your debt, and whether you realize it or not, it's quietly reaching into your wallet. That's why every American should care. In part 1, we also took a closer look at the conservative playbook for tackling the debt, and here's what we found. From Reagan to Bush to Trump, the strategy has largely been to cut taxes for the wealthy, betting on trickle-down economics to boost growth. At the same time, spending, especially on big-ticket items like the military, continued to rise. The result? Lower revenue, higher spending, and not exactly a recipe for paying down the national debt. Now, let's flip the script and look at the liberal approach to the national debt, how Democratic presidents have either added to it or worked to rein it in. And here's the twist. One of them may have actually cracked the code. He didn't just balance the budget, he set the country on a path that could have paid off the entire national debt by 2010 if we had stuck with it. Surprised? You might be, and what we can learn from his strategy today is more relevant than ever. Want to know how economic decisions actually affect your wallet, your job, and your future? Hit subscribe, because understanding the economy isn't just smart, it's survival. Before we reveal which Democratic president actually delivered a balanced budget and how he pulled it off, let's first take a look at the two modern Democrats who added to the national debt. We'll break down their impact on annual deficits, what drove their spending, and the strategies they used to try and keep things under control. Obama walked into the White House in the middle of the 2008-09 financial meltdown, a mess he didn't make, but definitely had to clean up. To stop the economy from flatlining, he dropped a $787 billion stimulus and kept the Bush-era bailouts rolling to save banks and major corporations. Translation: lots of spending, lots of debt. In 2012, he struck a deal. Taxes went up for the rich, stayed low for most people, and money started flowing back in. He also put a cap on government spending with the 2011 Budget Control Act, trimming things like defense and education. The good news? The annual deficit got sliced in half. The catch? The national debt still ballooned to nearly $20 trillion, mostly because the big stuff, like Social Security and Medicare, was left untouched. In short, he stopped the bleeding, but didn't fix the whole system. When Biden took office in 2021, the national debt was already sitting at a whopping $27.8 trillion. Then came COVID cleanup duty.
this is just the beginning of our work to build back the American economy better than it was before.
He dropped a $1.9 trillion rescue plan to keep the economy from falling apart. Great for recovery, not so great for the national tab. After that, he went big on rebuilding. Roads, clean energy, and computer chips made in the US. He tried to raise taxes on the rich and big corporations, but Trump's tax cuts, locked in until 2025, made that tricky. So even though his budget plans talked about deficit reduction, the spending didn't slow down, and by the end of his term, the debt hit $36.2 trillion. Supporters say he invested in the future. Critics say he handed the future a giant bill with interest. Some say Obama and Biden had no choice. They had to spend big to rescue the economy. They took steps to raise, and in Biden's case, proposed taxes on the wealthy, with the goal of helping to reduce the deficit over time. In both cases, political roadblocks and bad timing got in the way of making any big moves to tax the wealthy or corporations. As a result, neither one actually brought the deficit down. In fact, both ended up adding to the deficit, spending more, barely cutting anything, and falling short when it came to raising taxes on the wealthy. But now, let's talk about the one president who actually balanced the federal budget with an expected payoff of the national debt by 2010. Let's rewind to the 1990s. When President Clinton took office, the US was facing a $255 billion deficit, and the federal budget hadn't been balanced since 1969, back in the days of Lyndon B. Johnson, another Democrat. But by the time Clinton left, the US had a $236 billion surplus, and for the first time in decades, the national debt was actually shrinking. No, that's not a typo. It really happened. So how'd he pull it off? Clinton's strategy wasn't magic. It was math. He raised taxes on the wealthiest Americans, including bumping the top income tax rate to 39.6% for individuals earning over $250,000, which would be roughly $510,000 to $530,000 in today's dollars, adjusted for inflation. He also went after corporate taxes in 1993, in which he increased the top corporate income tax rate from 34% to 35% for companies earning over $10 million. That may sound minor, but it was symbolically important, especially after the 1986 Reagan-era tax reforms had lowered corporate rates. At the same time, he worked with a Republican-led Congress to cap the growth of federal spending, meaning the government still spent money, just not faster than the economy was growing. And instead of cutting support for everyday Americans, he expanded things like the Earned Income Tax Credit and introduced the Child Tax Credit, giving working families a bit more breathing room. In short, his approach was pretty simple. Ask a bit more from those doing really well, make smart choices about where the money goes, and don't gut programs people actually depend on. It was a mix of progressive tax policy and fiscal discipline. Sounds almost reasonable, right? From 1998 to 2001, the government wasn't just balancing the budget, it was running surpluses. The Congressional Budget Office even projected the U.S. could eliminate the entire national debt by 2010. Then came the Bush 2001 and 2003 tax cuts, 9/11, 2 wars, and the Great Recession. Deficits came roaring back, and the surpluses? Gone like frosted tips and floppy disks. Still, Clinton proved that a mix of smart tax policy, spending discipline, and political compromise can work. The question is, did we learn anything from it? Or did we just hit delete on that entire era? So, what does all this mean for us now? Since Clinton, we've seen a lot more spending, a lot more debt, and not much of a plan to fix it. The real question isn't whether it's possible, it's whether anyone in power today actually has the math skills to pull it off. Because here's the deal. Politicians love to say they're serious about fixing the debt, but slashing spending without asking the wealthy or big corporations to chip in? That's not a plan. It's a spin. As we continue to ignore the government debt, don't be surprised when the bill shows up at your door with interest.